was espousing views which the left, my colleagues at The Guardian, viewed as totally and utterly beyond the pale. They viewed them as belonging to the right, the far right. All kinds of epithets were thrown my way. And I was frankly bewildered because all I was doing was what I'd always done as a journalist, which was looking at what was going on, assessing it as best I could, telling what I thought was the truth about it in as fair-minded a way as I could, undoubtedly getting things wrong along the way, but I started from what I saw and drew a conclusion, and somehow this seemed to bring down the wrath of everyone on my head. And one of the areas that I got into terrible trouble with very early on, and it turned out in later years I realized that I was in terrible trouble from the start because it was actually one of the crucial issues that was going wrong in Britain and indeed in the West, was education. And so in this passage, I talk a little bit about what happened when I started to write about education. Not that I set out to make waves, far from it. What was about to happen took me entirely by surprise. In my second column, I wrote in support of the introduction by the Conservative government of a deeply contentious national curriculum, which represented a desperate attempt to ensure that teachers actually started teaching children something at school. I wrote that while the better off could buy their way out of the system through living in leafy suburbs or sending their children to private schools, the poor were trapped by lousy local schools to which there was no alternative for their own children. The reaction was instant and seismic. There was only one permitted explanation for the crisis in Britain's schools, and that was the spending cuts imposed by the heartless Thatcher government. To suggest that it might actually have a point about the breakdown of teaching was simply unthinkable. Literally overnight, I became right-wing. My Guardian colleagues gazed at me in perplexity and dismay. The fact that I'd written with passion about the plight of poor people was totally disregarded. This is a Daily Mail view, I was told, the greatest possible crime and insult, since in such circles the Mail is considered to be so right-wing it is off the graph. How had I reached this heretical position? By the staggering tactic of actually observing what was going on. I'd looked at the local state-funded schools for my own young children and found them seriously wanting, not because they lacked money, but because the teachers had increasingly abandoned structured teaching. There were 2 decent primary schools in my area. I could get my children into neither. They were hugely oversubscribed. In the end, I gave up and sent my children to independent schools, but I could afford it. I knew most could not. As ever, I was concerned about those at the bottom of the heap. Desperate parents and teachers, intimidated by the education orthodoxy, wrote to me in support. Friends and colleagues said I was a reactionary Gradgrind. Yet how could it be progressive to support an approach which inflicted its most devastating damage upon children at the bottom of the social heap, who depended absolutely on school to lift them out of disadvantage, but who were being left ignorant, illiterate, and innumerate? In 1990, I wrote that deteriorating education standards had little to do with low pay for teachers or schools starved of money. It was teachers and teaching that made the difference to children's lives. The problem was the number of bad teachers who were turning good teachers into a beleaguered minority, in what I described as the vicious circle of an education establishment that perpetuates its own myths down through generations of poorly taught children. Reaction to this column was so extreme that I devoted a further piece to it alone. There, I recorded that in the space of 2 weeks, I'd been described as ignorant, silly, intellectually vulgar, vicious, irresponsible, elitist, middle class, fatuous, dangerous, intemperate, shallow, strident, reactionary, near hysterical, propagandist, simplistic, well-paid, unbalanced, prejudiced, rabid, venomous, and pathetic. 3/4 of the letters I received have been hostile. Traditional teaching was equated with drilling, Dickens, and the new right, and my real crime was to have dared to air such arguments at all. But it was the letters of support which were the most startling and shed a devastating light on the situation they described as insanity. One educational psychologist wrote, "I greet with relief the beginning of debate about modern teaching practices. In my job, I see small children whose listening skills and ability to stay focused on a task are chronic. Yet they are put to learn in an environment which no undergraduate would have to suffer. Sometimes a brave teacher does arrange the table so that each child has a space of his or her own. The children love it, but the teacher has to move the tables back again. Children do not learn through play, but through instruction, explanation, guidance, motivation from an adult. Children need to be taught to make connections, to look for meanings. They do not learn from Wendy houses or from computers, they learn from people." And whenever I say this to a group of teachers, the older and wiser members of the group come to me afterwards and thank me for saying it. They've been waiting for years for someone to make this point, but for some reason, they cannot say this in public, and neither can I, which is why I do not want my name published. My job is important to me, and public condemnation of teaching methods will not be approved. But in an odd way, I cannot really pinpoint who will disapprove. When I saw that particular letter, a chill came over me. It was at that point that I realized something very bad indeed was happening to Britain. What was being described was more akin to life in a totalitarian state. Dissent was being silenced, and those who ran against the orthodoxy were being forced to operate in secret. Worse still, the very meaning of concepts such as education, teaching, and knowledge was being unilaterally altered, and thousands of children, particularly those at the bottom of the social heap, were being abandoned to ignorance and institutionalized disadvantage. If ever there was an abuse of power for journalists to investigate, this was surely it. But for most of my colleagues, it was I who was out of step. And that, and much more like it, is why I've started this company and M Books.